Hi everyone, it's Deidre. Thank you for joining me in this series. My hope is that you'll learn a couple of things that might help you in your own home projects. Today I want to go over a summary of products that are on the market and different methods that you can use for your furniture pieces, depending on what you have found, what you have brought home. And again, I'm trying to be comprehensive, but with anything, I'm sure there are lots of other opinions out there, and I am by no means an expert, but this is my knowledge and this is what has worked for me. So as a sample piece, just to show you, these are the oak chair bottoms, actually they're ash, for the dining room set that I'm doing. And just to give a visual demonstration of just what we're talking about, I'm not actually going to be applying anything on this today. So let's start with paint. Let's say you've come home with a piece that already has a finish on it, whether you found it at a thrift store, a yard sale, or whatever. Let's say it already has a finish on it. So what I'm going to do is I'll break this down into what old school methods were, what some of the new school methods are, and what I personally do. So the old school method with this would be to clean it really well. I like to use vinegar and water. There are other harsher products out there that people are comfortable with, but that's what I use. So you clean your piece really, really well. And then, like I said, old school would be, if you're going to paint it, to make sure you have a good primer. So what you would want is a primer that specifically talks about having good adhesion properties. So I have a couple that I've used. I don't have a big preference. I do like water-based. Some of the old school fellas will say you always have to prime in oil-based, and I've heard that. I personally have never had any problems with my water-based primers. And truth be told, California doesn't even sell an oil-based primer, my understanding. So you would want to prime this piece. And then after you primed it, because you do have that good adhesive layer at that point, you could use almost any paint. As a matter of fact, sometimes on small projects, these little color samples are a good way just to get the amount that you need for that project. And so then you'd have the primer, the paint, and then you would want to top coat it. Now top coating is your finish coat that protects whatever work you've done on the piece, and you definitely want to top coat. Some of the old school methods are to definitely use an oil-based polyurethane, let's say. The problem with that is if you have painted your piece white or cream and you really want that color, you don't want a version of that color or a yellowing of that color, so please stay away from your oil-based polyurethanes. What you want is a water-based finish coat or polyurethane. And I like this one, and I like this one because it's wipe-on. And for things like chairs that you'll see with spindles, I like that I can just put my hand in a sock and get this on there. It takes a few more coats. And to get the satin, I actually have to order this on Amazon. Some of the other sheens I've seen in the stores, but this one I order. Okay, new school. New school method is, you've heard of chalk paints. Here's a popular one, Annie Sloan chalk paint. There are mineral paints, there are milk paints. This is considered, or this is called a milk paint, but my understanding is it's just a very good water-based acrylic. And even your more normal lines of paint, this is Benjamin Moore. If you read very carefully and go into the research of some of their lines of paint, some of these, I think the advanced one, is considered to have the properties of a chalk paint. And what those wonderful properties are is you do not have to prime your piece. And that's why everyone raves about them, because it takes out that whole step of priming, and then you normally have to lightly sand your prime coat. It takes that whole step out. So people love these paints for good coverage and adhesion. So by eliminating that entire step of priming, then you can go ahead with this project piece and finish on with your top coats and everything like we talked about before. Now, part 3 is what I do. What I do is, if I find a piece that has some type of finish on it, I will always clean it. I will also take like 150 or 180 grit sandpaper and just rough it up a little bit, very quickly, really not a lot of time at all. And then I will take that step of using the sander deglosser or the liquid sandpaper. And what that does is two things. Take a cloth, a soft cloth, and wipe it down, and that will further open it up a little bit, but also you're getting all the sawdust off that you just generated by sanding. So it's a good step, and I always do it. So then I personally as well will go to one of the paints. I do love this paint. I love this paint. It's called a milk paint, and I like it because it has a little more coverage and a little more sheen than, say, a chalk paint, but there are people who love that chalky finish that you can distress. I do not recommend trying to distress some of the other paints because they do have that strength to them that is hard to break through. So if you want to do your distressing, please stick with like your Annie Sloan's or any other chalk paints that you see on the market. Okay, next step is, let's say you want to stain this piece, and that is what I'll be doing. I'm painting the chairs themselves, and then I'm staining the seats and the tabletop. So you'll see that through this project. So the old school method is traditional stains have to be able to penetrate the wood. So you have to remove the existing finish. And you would do that by stripping. And this is a stripping gel that I've used. I like it. They actually advertise you can use this inside because it doesn't have a lot of toxic fumes. I've not used it inside. I've used it in my garage, and it does. It works really well. So if I'm going to strip something, I'm going to use this. And then, of course, by doing that, you've raised the grain a little bit with the moisture, so you're going to want to sand it down. And then you have your piece ready to stain. You stick with the old school penetrating stains. You would still then wait for it to dry, and you would top coat it. And again, old school traditionally, you would use the oil-based polyurethane. I would probably stick with that with the old school stains. New school is you do not have to strip the piece. You can actually go straight to, with some products, staining. Again, I lightly sand, use the deglosser, and then you can try one of these great new stains that are almost like a paint because they have so much pigment in them, and you can apply them two ways. You can apply it as a paint with a paintbrush and leave it. I've done that with all the vanities. If you look back on my videos, works great. A little more drying time, especially if you're working outside. Or you can do it more traditionally, which I'm going to try on this project, is to put it on and wipe it off. I think I want a little bit of a lighter finish on this, but I do like the color of the Java Gel stain. So at that point, because that's an oil base, you don't always have to stick to the same base for the top coat, but I do. If it's staining, I don't mind the yellowing and the little bit of richness that that gives, so I will use an oil-based polyurethane for a top coat. Okay, so that's the new school method of staining, and that's what I do. I do the new school method. Okay, so the third category of projects is if you were to bring home something that has no finish on it, or you bought a piece that was unfinished. In that case, if you're going to paint it, you would lightly sand it, use your primer, sand it again, and pick out your paint. At that point, you can use whatever paint you want, and then you would top coat it like we talked about, sticking probably with the water-based top coats. Now, depending on how much grain you have in it, you might make a different decision. You might decide you like that grain. If you like that grain and you want to use one of the new school chalk paints and you want to give it that texture, well then you would leave it a little more raw. You would sand it, but you wouldn't feel like you wanted to prime it at that point. You don't mind if some of that oak or ash or mahogany comes through. It would give the piece some character. So you do not have to prime these pieces. But if you do want that good coverage with a paint, then you would prime and then paint. And then with paints, I still again typically will top coat with the water-based polyurethane. The only exception to that is if I was going to put something as a tabletop. A tabletop or something that you would put a lot of moist items on. The only problem with the water-based poly is because it is water-based. I've not had the experience, but I've heard people say that if you put something very wet on it and it stays there, you might get some cloudiness. And that again is the moisture in the product. So if I was doing a tabletop and painting it, I would not do white, I would not do cream, I would try and do something that would withstand the slight yellowing that you will get with an oil-based poly. Now, if you want to stain this piece, what you would do is you would lightly sand it, get it as smooth as you want, and if the piece were pine or had a lot of grain that you wanted the stain to have a more consistent or not have as much variation with the grain, then you would want to use a pre-stain or a wood conditioner. That kind of allows the wood to absorb a little bit of product ahead of time, and you won't get as much variation on those very textured or very obvious woods. So if you're staining it, wood condition, you can use either old school penetrating stain at that point, or you can use the new school products. And then you would again make your top coat, probably on a stained piece, your oil-based poly. Okay, you may have had to take notes on that. That was a lot of information. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section and I will try to answer them. Again, there's a lot of opinions out there, but this is what I do. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to the next installment in this series.